What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and in this video, we're moving on from IOC Chaos format. We're moving in to Ancient Sanctuary Chaos format. And, this isn't really like an official format that I'd cover. So like normally I sort of cover, certain formats in a lot of detail, and those formats are generally the ones that, come with their own ban list. They come with a new set of cards, and they're relatively different from the others. Ancient Sanctuary Chaos is different from the others, but it shares the ban list with Invasion of Chaos. So it puts it into a weird, like, nebulous position. A lot of people mark Chaos format as being with the AST cards. So, you could potentially play Chaos format just including Ancient Sanctuary as well. But there are certain cards in Ancient Sanctuary that enable certain strategies that are not really the most fun to play against, and that many people have sort of like tested and theorized that are very, very good, and potentially, maybe not tier 0, but definitely like tier 1, high tier 1 maybe, and can definitely cause the format to be pretty miserable. And I'll get into what those strategies might be. But this format is going to be a bit different from what I normally do. And so, I'm not really going to go as deep into it as I did with like Chaos format, for instance. Now, the good thing is a lot of the things that I covered in Chaos format will carry over to this one, because a lot of the decks are not really that changed. Ancient Sanctuary did release some very good sort of utility cards, but those cards are sort of a lot less important than they have been in previous formats, and they won't be like super meta warping. And I'll discuss those as well in this video too. So instead of doing like a typical format guide as I've normally done, I'm going to spend this video just going through all the cards in Ancient Sanctuary, ranking them, talking about them, and talking about what new decks could arise from them. So this isn't really going to be like a format guide as you're used to. It'll be more of a set guide to Ancient Sanctuary, and then I'll talk about the format in general in future videos. So hopefully this sort of mix-up in format is not too confusing with you. If you're new to the channel, you can ignore that whole thing and then just dive into the cards here and sort of follow me through this journey of this set. This is a very unique set in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. This is a milestone for the TCG, as it's the last super big set of the DM era. So up until this point, a lot of the DM era booster sets have been combinations of multiple OCG booster sets. So that means that they're really big. They've got a lot going on in them. And this all changes after Ancient Sanctuary with the next set to follow. So Ancient Sanctuary is the last of the really big ones. And so that means there is a lot to cover in it. But before we actually cover it, if you enjoy this sort of content, please do subscribe to the channel. It really does help a lot, and I'd really like to reach 1,200 subscribers soon. We're almost there, so it would be really cool if we reach that by the end of February. But also, before I dive into the individual Ancient Sanctuary cards, I think it's good to provide context for what the game was like at this time by looking at the limited list. So when Ancient Sanctuary was released, this was the limited list at the time, the April 2004 limited list. I'm not really going to go super in depth in this limited list because I've covered this in my other videos, my Chaos format videos. So you can check out that if you want an in-depth analysis of it. But what I want to point out here is that BLS and CED are both legal at 1 copy, and that makes Chaos the best deck in the room by a lot. So, Chaos decks are the ones to beat and are still very powerful in AST Chaos if you do play that format. So, it's good to keep in mind that context, that Chaos is the best deck in the room and is better than a lot of the jank that Ancient Sanctuary might introduce. But with this sort of out of the way, like, you can look at the cards, on this list on your screen here, if you so choose. But I'm not really going to cover too much else on this list. It is just good to know that nothing is banned yet. The Chaos monsters are supreme, and you have a lot of very powerful spells. But now that we've sort of covered this very briefly, let's dive into the actual cards in Ancient Sanctuary and get to what everyone's looking for. Okay, now that we've shown off the limited list, let's actually talk about the new cards in Ancient Sanctuary, starting with the cards that I think are actually not bad in a generic sense. There are also cards that are very good in a very specific context, but, I figured I'd talk about the more general cards that you could see splashed into pretty much any deck in the format, because they're just generally good utility cards. And let's start with the monsters. First up, we've got, just going in alphabetical order, we got Blowback Dragon. This is a level 6 machine, 2300 attack, 1200 defense. It says once per turn, you can target one card your opponent controls, toss a coin 3 times, and destroy that target if at least 2 of the results are heads. Now, this is a tribute monster, which is a bit awkward. Tribute monsters are a little bit hard to get out in this format. or not the hardest to get out, but is it worth the investment to bring it out? That is a debate that you have to have if you want to play this card. But it can potentially pop a card that your opponent controls as well, which can sort of make up for the investment a little bit. And 2300 is a decent attack stat in this format, so it is a card that you can potentially consider if you are looking for a tribute monster. Next up, we got Legendary Jiu-Jitsu Master. This is a level 3 rock, 1300 attack, 1800 defense. It says if this defense position card battles a monster at the end of the damage step, place that monster on top of the deck. So this is a good way to sort of draw like your opponent if they attack in with something like a Sengan or Witch, and that gets bounced back to the top of the deck. That's really good for you because it's an annoying card off the field, and also your opponent's drawing to that next turn. This can be good at dealing with a lot of problematic things. Also, dealing with tribute monsters potentially, because then it's back in your opponent's hand and your opponent can't necessarily bring that out right away on the following turn potentially. So Legendary Jiu-Jitsu Master, pretty great card here. It is Earth though, so it doesn't really fit with the Chaos typing, which can be a bit awkward for a lot of decks, and it may be a reason why a lot of decks won't play this card, but it is an interesting card to consider and a not bad card overall. Next up, we got Night Assailant. Night Assailant is one of the best cards in this set, and it is a flip monster, level 3, 200 attack, 500 defense. It says flip target one monster your opponent controls, destroy that target. That is a pretty good effect, but the real power in this card comes from the second part of the effect. It says if this card is sent from the hand to the graveyard, target one flip monster in your graveyard, add that target to your hand. Now you'll note that I didn't read the except Night Assailant, and that's because at this time, the version of this effect actually could add a Night Assailant as long as it was not the specific card here. So basically, like if you discard a Night Assailant, you couldn't add back the card you just discarded, but you could add back another Night Assailant in your graveyard. So you could potentially loop flip monsters with this. If you activate Graceful Charity, draw 3 cards, pitch 2 Night Assailants, you can have them target each other, add back both to hand, and be pretty good in that way as well. Night Assailant's just a very, very powerful card at just preserving card advantage. In addition to its popping effect, which is nice, it's also a dark as well. It can also get back things like Magician of Faith as well. So there are a variety of flip monsters that it can get back that are generally useful and see play. So this card is very, very good. Next up, we got End of Anubis, which is a very interesting card. It's also a level 6 monster like Blowback Dragon. So it is a tribute, 2500 attack, 0 defense. Says while this card is face up on the field, all effects of spell, trap, and monster cards that target a card in the graveyard or that activate in the graveyard are negated. So this is actually very powerful because it stops things like Sangan, Witch of the Black Forest. It can stop Night Assailant as well if it's using its discard effect. So this is very good at stopping a lot of your opponent's very powerful cards. That being said, it may be a little bit too targeted for this format in particular. It's very good at stopping like Sangan, Witch, Mystic Tomato, all that stuff. But like, given that it only hits a certain number of monsters, and there are monsters like, for instance, DD Warrior Lady that doesn't activate in graveyard but on field, that can get rid of this. It remains to be seen whether this is actually a very good card that you'd want to include, or just maybe a side deck tech against certain decks that are more graveyard reliant. Next up, we've got one of the other best cards in the format, or in the set that is, and that is Zaborg, the Thunder Monarch. Zaborg is a 2400 attack, 1000 defense, Thunder type monster, level 5. It says if this card is tribute summon, target one monster on the field, destroy that target. Now this is the first Monarch in the game's history, and that is a big milestone because the Monarchs are some of the game's most iconic cards. As more Monarchs get released, you get very powerful decks just based around these Monarchs. And Zaborg is a very strong card, not just because it has a powerful effect for destroying a monster on field, but also because it's a light. And lights are kind of hard to come by in this format where you're looking for chaos monsters. There are some good lights, like DD Warrior Lady is a good light, but that will often banish itself. Shining Angel can get out of DD Warrior Lady while ending up in grave, so that's pretty good. Magician of Faith sees play as well. So there are some lights, that do see play in this format that are pretty good, but you definitely have more good darks than more good lights. And so adding another good light monster in this format is pretty good. And if you're playing things like Gravekeeper's Spy, you can more easily facilitate tribute summoning this monster. And it may be the sort of premier tribute monster of choice in this format over something like Jinzo, Hadas, etc. So this card is very, very good for that reason. Moving on to these spells, I've only got one sort of generically good spell here, and that is Enemy Controller. And what a good spell it is. This is a quick play spell that has 2 effects. It says activate one of them. Target one face-up monster your opponent controls, change that target's battle position, or tribute one monster. Then target one face-up monster your opponent controls. Take control of that target until the end phase. This is very good. You can potentially switch a powerful monster to defense to attack over it. You can also steal it for a turn, which is very nice, and potentially tribute it off for a monster of your own own. So enemy controller, very, very versatile card here. And it's a card that maybe won't see play in like this format, because there are just so many other more powerful cards, but it's very, very versatile. We'll see play in the future, and it's good to know about and maybe tinker with if you do want to play AST Chaos. Now, for the traps, these are a bit less good, but I do think that they are sort of like general use. So, there is that. We've got Curse of Anubis, which says change all effect monsters on the field to defense position until the end of this turn. The original defense of those monsters becomes 0. Also, the battle positions cannot be changed. That last part doesn't really matter. The point is that this is sort of like a battle trap. You can stop things like BLS from attacking in and killing you. You can stop things like Kaiku as well. So, and also, it gives you follow-up for the next turn, potentially attacking over the defense position monster with one of your own monsters. So this card is a potential card that you could potentially use and see play. But I don't really think it's that good. I just have it here because it's more general use. Same with Draining Shield. Draining Shield is a normal trap that says if an opponent's monster declares an attack, target the attacking monster, negate that attack, and if you do gain life points equal to the target's attack. So this is like also sort of a general use battle trap that you can use. But again, it's not really that good. It does negate one attack, which is nice. And it's sort of like an opposite of Magic Cylinder, where you actually get to gain life points. So, it makes you a bit more resistible to things like a Chaos Emperor Dragon activation, killing you. But it is kind of situational. It's not really the best. And it doesn't actually clear your opponent's monster, which is important. You really do want to be clearing your opponent's monsters with these traps. So Draining Shield, I don't really think we'll see much play, just like Curse of Anubis, but they are good cards to know about because they are just like sort of generally decent. If you ever do a draft of Ancient Sanctuary, this card's probably going to be really good and a staple. But for constructed play, I don't really think that these cards are that good. But that's going to do it for these sort of generically good cards that I see in Ancient Sanctuary. Again, there are some more niche cards that, are very powerful, which we will get to very soon. But I think the fact that there are so few sort of like generically good cards in this set is sort of a testament to how wonky the set is. There are a lot of things that get added which do change the game quite a bit, but there also are a lot of stinkers in this set. But let's talk about something that actually does change the game a bit by introducing a brand new deck. Now, I said that this introduces a brand new deck, and you could argue with me on that because reasoning decks have existed for a bit. Reasoning is a way to sort of cheat out big monsters from the deck, and when paired with things like Dark Magician of Chaos or Sacred Crane or something, you could potentially build a deck out of that. In previous formats. But Ancient Sanctuary released Monster Gate, which is really what takes this deck to the next level. The reason for this is that Reasoning, while it can potentially get out something like Dark Magician of Chaos, there is the ability for your opponent to potentially correctly guess what you bring out and prevent you from getting a summon. So if you are going for something like Dark Magician of Chaos, your opponent's probably always going to call 8 off Reasoning because Dark Magician of Chaos is at 3 in this format, and it's easily the best reasoning target to hit. So your opponent won't want that to go through. They'll just be calling 8 and you'll never get your Dark Magician of Chaos on field. Monster Gate alleviates that problem a bit. It says tribute 1 monster, excavate cards from the top of your deck until you excavate a monster that can be normal summoned or set, special summon it, and also send the other excavated cards to the graveyard. So with this, as long as you hit a monster off Reasoning, then you can have a monster to tribute off for Monster Gate and then potentially guaranteed hit something like a Dark Magician of Chaos or a Sacred Crane. Like, this card lets you sort of guarantee a summon, which is just super, super important and is really needed for this deck to actually be good. And now it's here. So, I think this deck is potentially tier 1. Just being able to Monster Gate out a ton of Dark Magician of Chaos, mill a bunch of spells to grave, like Monster Reborn, etc., to potentially get other cards out from grave. You could also potentially try and pull off an FDK with this, because Dimension Fusion is also at 3 copies in this format. If you like Monster Gate to then get out Dark Magician of Chaos, which can get out other Dark Magician of Chaoses, then you can get back like Dimension Fusion, and if you have something like Catapult Turtle or Mass Driver to tribute off those Dark Magician of Chaoses, and you have the Dimension Fusion, you can activate Dimension Fusion multiple times and burn your opponent to death. And one key to this is Spell Economics. Spell Economics is a continuous spell, so you do not pay life points to activate spell cards. So the idea is that you can use Dimension Fusion with Spell Economics to just keep recycling your Demox. If you do play just like Mass Driver, Dimension Fusion, and Spell Economics, then you can potentially just recycle all of these spells from grave just through consecutive Dark Magician Chaos summons. and then you'll potentially construct your FTK from that. I don't necessarily think the FTK version of this deck is the better version of this deck, but it is something you can potentially do that's a little bit cheesy and is a bit better in this format than it has been in the past, because Spell Economics lets you actually not pay for Dimension Fusion, which can be very, very good. Now, also, another deck that does benefit from Monster Gate here, speaking of FTK decks, is Magical Scientist FTK. Magical Scientist FTK is very good if you can guarantee a summon, because it lets you sort of construct your combos in different ways and sort of guarantee that you get Scientist, Turtle, whatever you really need. Also, Monster Gate will trigger Last Will, so that's very good as well, because you can potentially get it a monster and then get it another monster with Last Will, which is pretty good. There is also one more piece that Magical Scientist did get in this format, and that is Mystic Walk. With Mystic Walk, this is a quick play spell. This is tribute one monster, select either its attack or defense, and gain that many life points. And with Mystic Walk, Magical Scientist plus Last Will plus Walk is just FTK, because what you do, you bring out Magical Scientist, you pay 1,000 to bring out a fusion monster like, Dark Flare Knight or something with a bunch of attack. You use Mystic Walk to tribute it, and then you use the Last Will to bring out another monster. Now, I ordered that wrong. You have to activate Last Will first in this format before activating Mystic Walk. But either way, you're getting out a powerful monster, from deck like Catapult Turtle. And you're also still having enough life points to actually pay for the Scientist to actually kill your opponent through Turtle. So, Scientist FTK really did get some boosts in this format. I do think it's worth experimenting with here. But Monster Gate, just really, really strong card. Really cool to see Reasoning Gate decks now officially in the format. And I do think that these will be very, very good and very degenerate to play against. But it'll be exciting to see what people actually do with that. But let's dive into some of the other decks in this format, because, while Monster Gate Reasoning decks are pretty good, there also were a lot of pretty bad decks as well. Now, if Ancient Sanctuary had a theme to it, that theme would be fairies. Archlord Zerato was the cover card of the set, and it did release a variety of good fairies, including the first fairy archetype, which is Agents. Now, the agents really revolve around this one card, Sanctuary in the Sky. Sanctuary in the Sky is a field spell that says battle damage to the controller of a fairy monster from a battle involving that monster becomes 0. So this lets you sort of stall out a bit. If you've got a bunch of fairies on your side of the field, your opponent can't really get as aggressive as they otherwise could be, because you're not taking damage from those battles. So that's pretty decent. But, the reason why the deck revolves around this is because there are a variety of agent monsters that actually need Sanctuary in the Sky on field to actually use their effects. Now, that being said, the best of the agent monsters, in my opinion, is the Agent of Creation Venus, and this does not need Sanctuary in the Sky on field. Maybe that's why it's one of the best. It's a level 3 fairy that says you can pay 500 life points, special summon one Mystic Shine Ball from your hand or deck. Mystic Shine Ball is just a level 2 fairy, normal monster, 500 attack, 500 defense. So it's not really the best thing in the world, but the reason why I think this is the best of the agent monsters is because it actually gets you light fodder for things like your chaos monsters. So that's pretty good. It also deck thins as well. Now, to use this, you do have to be playing the mystical shine balls in your deck originally, which maybe isn't really the best thing in the world. But you are getting more lights out of the deck, and there are some things, other traps and things like that in the deck that really do want you to have light monsters around. So I do think the Agent of Creation Venus can help facilitate that sort of game plan. But the other agents also are nothing to scoff at. First is Agent of Force Mars. This is a level 3 fairy. It says unaffected by spell cards or effect while you control the Sanctuary of the Sky and your life points are higher than your opponent's. This card gains attack and defense equal to the difference. So this can be very good if you get yourself into a good sort of life point position, which if you have Sanctuary of the Sky on field and you're not really taking battle damage from battles between monsters, then, that could be very likely the case, and this can gain a fair amount of attack. Now, the issue is if, you don't have Sanctuary in the Sky, this card is a 0 attack, 0 defense monster, which isn't the best. But, it can potentially lead to a big play if you do have the Sanctuary in the Sky there. Similarly, the Agent of Judgment Saturn also has an effect that is used when you have more life points than your opponent. This is a level 6 fairy monster, 2400 attack, 0 defense. It says, while your life points are higher than your opponent's, you can tribute this card, inflict damage to your opponent equal to the difference. You must control the Sanctuary in the Sky to activate and to resolve this effect. You cannot conduct your battle phase the turn you activate this effect. So the idea is if you get a bunch of damage in over the previous turns, and then, you just want to finish your opponent off, you go for the Agent of Judgment Saturn, deal that damage, and finish your opponent off that way. So Agents is very much a deck that sort of revolves around gaining more life points than your opponent, and just, sort of punishing your opponent for that difference. Now, the reason why this isn't necessarily the best is because if you're already sort of gaining that differential where you are ahead, then you should be trying to win the game through other means, basically, because you're already in a winning position a lot of the time. So, especially if you have the amount of cards that you actually need to facilitate these combos, you don't really need the sort of snowball effect from that. You just need to sort of just keep pushing your advantage forward. So that's why Agents is not really the best deck in this format, but it does have some other tools to help it get into those positions. Solar Ray is a big one. This is a normal trap that says inflict 600 points of damage to your opponent's life points for each face-up light monster on your side of the field. And you'll notice that all of these monsters are light. Solar Ray also pairs well with Venus because if you bring out a bunch of mystical shine balls, that can be easily 4 light monsters on field for Solar Ray. That's 2,400 points of damage. Now, to be fair, you'll have taken 15 to actually bring out those mystical shine balls, so it's not like the most in terms of like increasing the differential, but it is still something, so that is good to keep in mind. The last agent monster in the deck is the Agent of Wisdom Mercury. This is a level 4 light monster, 0 attack, 1700 defense. It says once per turn during your standby phase, if you controlled this face-up card in your monster zone and had no cards in your hand at the end of your opponent's last turn, draw 1 card. I don't know why this is an agent. It really doesn't pair with the rest of the deck. I mean, I guess Venus doesn't really pair with the rest of the deck either, but like Venus is like honestly probably the best of these cards, even if it's not really that good in this format. But it also pairs with Solar Ray, I guess. But Agent of Wisdom Mercury really pairs with almost nothing in this deck, because a lot of the time you will have extra cards in hand. Now, there is some cards in this deck that can potentially discard cards, and maybe that's why Agent of Wisdom Mercury is here. Light of Judgment is a big one. This is a normal trap. This is if the Sanctuary in the Sky is on the field, discard 1 light monster to the graveyard, apply one of the following effects. Look at your opponent's hand and discard 1 card from their hand, or send 1 card your opponent controls to the graveyard. This is a pretty great card. It can either be a hand rip or just, an easy way to get rid of a problematic card that your opponent has. So that makes it pretty good. And you are discarding a light, so if you do have extra light monsters in hand, like Mystical Shine Balls, then, you can pitch that, and then maybe you won't have any cards in hand, and Agent of Wisdom Mercury can activate. But it's just really, really convoluted. I don't really understand why it's really here, especially when there are other cards in this deck that are clearly meant to be in this deck that sort of conflict with it. One of them is Beckoning Light. This is a normal trap that says discard your entire hand. Then for each card you discard to the graveyard by this effect, add 1 light monster from your graveyard to your hand. And this is, one of the ways that you can sort of use Light of Judgment a bit better. If you have other cards in hand, but you really need light monsters for Light of Judgment, you can use Beckoning Light, get back those cards. You can also potentially pitch things like Shine Balls off Beckoning Light to get other light monsters that are more powerful, or you could just add the Shine Balls to hand to use with Light of Judgment later, also maybe to bring out with Venus later as well. There are some interesting things that you can do with this. So, I really don't get why Agent of Wisdom Mercury is here, especially because Beckoning Light seems like a better card to actually play in this deck than the Agent of Wisdom Mercury. Now, there are some other sets of monsters here that can go with this strategy. The main one being Archlord Zerato. And Archlord Zerato is based around the normal mantra Warrior of Zera. Warrior of Zera is a level 4 normal warrior, 1600 attack, 1600 defense, and it's just a normal monster. So, it can be searched out with Reinforcing the Army. That's nice. But basically, the reason why this goes with Zerato is because it's Zerato's summoning condition. This card cannot be normal summon or set, and it must be summoned by attributing 1 face-up Warrior of Zera on your side of the field while Sanctuary in the Sky is on the field. And if the Sanctuary in the Sky is on your side of the field, by discarding 1 light monster from your hand to the graveyard, destroy all monsters on your opponent's side of the field. And if the Sanctuary in the Sky is not on your side of the field, this effect is not applied. So basically, this is a board wipe if you've got Sanctuary in the Sky and a light monster in hand. And it's 2800 attack, so that is pretty decent in terms of a stat line. So, that's really the boss monster for the agent archetype. I think you can honestly cut out a lot of these other agents and just try and go for the Zerato play, maybe with some other light fairies, which we will get into later. But, while we're talking about Zera, there actually is another route that Zera can go down. Zerato is the good route, it becomes an angel, but there is an evil route where it becomes a demon, and that is Mazera Deville. This is the same stats on Archlord Zerato, 2800 attack, 2300 defense, cannot be normal summon or set. This card cannot be special summoned except by attributing 1 face-up to Warrior of Zera on your side of the field, while Pandemonium is on your side of the field, or it's on the field. period, I guess. But your opponent's never going to be playing Pandemonium. If Pandemonium is on your side of the field, when you special summon this card, your opponent discards 3 random cards from their hand. And if Pandemonium is not on your side of the field, this effect is not applied. Pandemonium is the Archfiend's field spell. It really pairs with just the Archfiends. So I guess this is potentially Archfiend support as well. But the effect here is good, but generally the Zerato effect I think is a little bit better because you have more control over it. Occasionally your opponent will have less than 3 cards in hand, and Deville will clear all the cards in their hand. But if they got Sinister Serpents there as well, then it's really not as good. Also, it doesn't really deal with their established threats on field. You could argue that its attack and defense would do that already. But, you know, I still like the fact that Zerato pairs a little bit better with its own deck. And also can just be a board wipe and get him for a ton of damage that way. But, you know, Deville also is not the worst thing in the world. And, you know, if your opponent does have, like, low resources and you just rip 3 cards in their hand, that can be very, very nice. Now, moving on from the cards specifically mentioning Sanctuary in the Sky, let's just talk about other fairies that you can play with it. In terms of just other fairies released in this set, Absorbing Kid from the Sky is a 1300 attack fairy, level 4. When this card destroys a monster and sent to the graveyard as a result of battle, increase your life points by the level of the destroyed monster by 300 points. So this is a way to increase that life point differential, power up your, you know, Agent of Force, your Agent of Saturn. So, you know, it can be decent in that regard. However, 1300 attack is not really the best attack stat to, like, be doing this with. So I don't really think that, you know, this card is that good. But it is something that you can potentially use, maybe buff it up with like equip spells or, you know, Hoshiningen, which I'll mention in a second, and maybe that would be a little bit better. Also, Moki Moki is here. It's just kind of funny. You wouldn't really play this in a fairy deck, especially if you're already playing Mystical Shine Balls to pair with Venus. But, you know, this is an iconic card in the game's history, so kind of cool that it gets introduced at this point. And it does pair with the normal monster strategy that's also present in this set, which I'll cover soon. If we're talking about other light fairies that have just existed in the game up to this point, then you do have slightly more options, but, you know, the pickings are still slim. Shining Angel is probably the best of the ones that you can do. Shining Angel can turn into just an Agent of Force, which is kind of nice. It's a light fairy as well. But, you know, ultimately, I don't really think it's the best, as a lot of the monsters in this archetype have over 1400 attack. I mean, I guess Agent of Wisdom also has 0 attack, so you can bring that as well. Absorbing Kid also has less than 1500 attack, so yeah, you can potentially play Shining Angel, but it's just kind of rough in this deck. Historic Fairy is probably a better fairy to play in this deck. You know, it says tribute 2 monsters on your side of the field to increase your life points by 1,000. So you can tribute 2 Mystical Shine Balls to do that. You can tribute 2 of other cards that are not really being that useful for you. Now, the issue with tributing 2 Mystical Shine Balls is that you've likely paid 1,000 to bring them out with Agent of Creation Venus, but Historic Fairy at least can, you know, like, offer to sort of change the life point differential. So, you know, it is pretty decent in that way. It also has 1800 attack, which is pretty decent. Air Knight Parshath is a card that can get you more advantage. Level 5 fairy, 1900 attack, 1400 defense. You know, attacks over defense position monster, and you draw a card, which is pretty good. Assura Priest can be used to clear away things like your opponent's scapegoats, for instance, if they're playing that. And it's a Spirit, which is kind of annoying because it adds back to hand, but that does kind of make it pair with Light of Judgment and Beckoning Light. So, you know, it is good in that regard, I guess, as well. Goddess of Whim is a card that can potentially be a 1900 attack beater, but it generally won't be. So, yeah, or I guess not generally won't be, but like there's 50-50 chance of getting to that point. And do you want to play a card that, you know, isn't guaranteed to be that? I'm not really sure that's worth it. Hoshiningen is an interesting card to experiment with. It buffs up all your light monsters on the field by 500 attack. So this can buff up things like, you know, your Mystical Shine Balls. And, you know, just having enough 1,000 attack monsters can be potentially pretty good. And you're not really worried about its low attack stat as much because, you know, Sanctuary in the Sky prevents taking battle damage from it. So this card is a potential card to consider in this sort of deck. Soul Period Light can convert your Mystical Shine Balls a bit more profitably than a lot of the other cards here because it banishes 2 light monsters from the grave to bring out 2,000 attack monster. So that's pretty good. If we're talking about other boss monsters to go into for this deck, Guardian Angel Joan is a 2 tribute monster, 2800 attack, that can increase the life point differential because when it destroys a monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, you gain life points equal to that monster's original attack in the graveyard. So, you know, that can increase the life point differential, make it so that your opponent has less life points, you have more, which is pretty good. Moisture Creature is also a light fairy, doesn't really synergize with the deck that much. But, 2800 attack is nothing to scoff at. It can potentially also clear away your opponent's spells or traps, so that's something as well. Another boss monster potentially is Shinato, King of a Higher Plane. This is a light fairy that is a ritual monster, so kind of tricky to pull off that way, but that's 3300 attack. And there is another fairy that pairs very well with ritual strategies, which is Manju of the 10,000 Hands. So you can potentially go for something like that. Now, if we're talking about non-light fairies, we've also got earth-based fairies. We've got Agido, Mudora, and Kelbeck. Those are the main ones that I think would potentially see play. Mudora, because it just gets really big. Kelbeck passes an opponent's monster to hand. And Agido can potentially revive a fairy from grave. So, these are cards to consider as well, although they're a bit less good because they don't synergize with things like Solar Ray, Light of Judgment, Beckoning Light, etc. You can also go for a bit of a fusion strategy here with St. Joan. Forgiving Maiden is a light monster, and there are more fusion support cards released in this set, like King of the Swamp, which can make this a little bit more feasible than it has been in formats past. But this doesn't really pair with your Light of Judgment or Beckoning Light. So it's debatable whether you want to go with this route or not. But it is a 2800 attack point monster, so that's pretty decent. And it is a fairy indeed. So that's going to do it for the agent section of this video, though. I don't really think this deck is that good, but it is interesting to sort of tinker with a little bit. Unfortunately, it just falls into the trap of a lot of the decks in this format, where these decks just can't compete against Chaos, which is kind of rough. But, it is still something to consider and tinker with if you are looking for a fun rogue strategy. Speaking of rogue strategies and Moki Moki, which is on screen right now, let's dive into the other main rogue strategy that this set introduces. Ancient Sanctuary introduced arguably one of the worst sort of themes or strategies that's ever been released in a Yu-Gi-Oh! Booster set, and that's just revolving around these very low-level normal monsters. Now, if we're talking about these low-level normal monsters, it is good to know which low-level normal monsters have the most amount of attack. So, Ancient Sanctuary did increase the attack cap on a lot of these low-level normal monsters. For instance, in terms of level 2 normal monsters, you've got Fiend Scorpion, Pharaoh Servant, and Pharaonic Protector, all at 900 attack. And for level 1, you've got Kozaki and Gigabyte. Previously, the highest level attack level 1 attack was Oppressed People at 400. I still think Oppressed People is probably better than Kozaki because, Oppressed People has 2,000 defense as opposed to 400 defense. But, Kozaki is a very iconic card, and so is Gigabyte. But, it basically revolves around these cards, buffing them up for various reasons. And the main reason for these level 2 or lower normal monsters is to trigger Law of the Normal. Law of the Normal is a normal spell that says you can only activate this card while there are 5 face-up level 2 or lower normal monsters on your side of the field. Both players discard all cards in their hand and destroy all cards in the field except level 2 or lower normal monsters. So this is basically like a CD activation without the damage, and it then lets you attack in with all your normal monsters. So this can potentially be a really big swing if you can actually set it up. However, having 5 face-up level 2 or lower normal monsters on your side of the field is a really big ask. I think scapegoat tokens will count, but you don't necessarily want to use those because then you've just got a bunch of 0 attack, 0 defense normal monsters on your side of the field and no real way to capitalize on them. So I think Law of the Normal is a really interesting win con to build to, but I'm not really sure how you're winning after that. I think the way they intended you to win after that was to buff your level 2 or lower normal monsters before you actually go for this with things like 1000 Energy and Triangle Power. 1000 Energy is a normal spell that says increase the original attack and defense of all face-up level 2 normal monsters except tokens on your side of the field by 1000 points until the end phase. Destroy all level 2 normal monsters on your side of the field during the end phase. So if you buff up all your level 2 or lower normal monsters, that's 5,000 attack total if you've got 5 of them. And then, if you've got all of them being 900 or more attack, then that's 4,500 attack on top of that at minimum. So that is indeed an OTK. Triangle Power is kind of similar. It is for level 1 normal monsters, and it says increase the original attack and defense of all face-up level 1 normal monsters, except tokens, on your side of the field by 2,000 points until the end phase. Destroy all level 1 normal monsters on your side of the field during the end phase. So with these, you need less level 1 normal monsters to actually pull it off. For instance, like only 4 of them is enough, because then that'll be 8,000 damage total. I think actually, so for 3 of them and maximum attack at 400, then that would turn this into 2,400 times 3, which would be almost there, 7,200. And then your level 2 monsters, assuming that you're activating Law of the Normal, your level 2 monsters would then get you the rest of the way. So, it basically turns your setup into an OTK more often, I think, than 1000 Energy does. But it is a bit more of an ask because the level 1 monsters are a bit worse. But maybe if you're playing a bunch of oppressed people, it's not as bad. You've also got Sword of the Soul Eater to buff up your level 3 or lower normal monsters, but you really only be using this on level 2 or lower normal monsters, and you'd never really be using this with Law of the Normal because it gets sent to the graveyard as well. But this is an equip spell, only can be equipped to level 3 or lower normal monsters on your side of the field, and when you activate this card, tribute all normal monsters except tokens on your side of the field, except the equipped monster. Increase the attack of the equipped monster by 1,000 points for each normal monster that you tributed. So this can also try and get you into like an OTK sort of scenario. At max, you're gonna go up by 4,000 attack, which is not bad for an equipped spell, but it is very situational and a bit tough to pull off. Now, since it does mention level 3 or lower normal monsters, I figure that I'll talk about Sonic Duck and Dragon Zombie, which are the two level 3 or lower normal monsters with the highest amount of attack at 1,700 and 1,600 respectively. But I feel like if you are going for a normal monster strategy, you want to be going for the Law of the Normal route rather than the Dragon Zombie and Sonic Duck route. Although there are actually ways to support those, as we'll talk about soon. Enchanted Fitting Room is potentially one of them. This is a normal spell that says pay 800 life points, activate the top 4 cards of your deck, and special summon all activated level 3 or lower normal monsters. Also after that, shuffle the rest back into your deck. So this is a way to get a bunch of monsters on the field for potentially something like Law of the Normal. Using this can get you 4 monsters on the field, you normal summon the last one, and then go for Law of the Normal, and that's pretty good. But, with the level 3 or lower normal monsters, you could potentially just stock your deck up with things like Sonic Duck and Dragon Zombie, get a bunch of powerful monsters like that, and go off to the races there. So that's potentially an option. This is probably one of the best cards in the normal monster deck if you're going for it, because just having a bunch of normal monsters on the field to convert into other things is very good. Speaking of board presence, Human Wave Tactics is another way to preserve board presence with your normal monsters. This is once per turn during the end phase. If your level 2 or lower normal monster or monsters was destroyed by battle this turn, special summon level 2 or lower normal monsters from your deck equal to the number of your level 2 or lower normal monsters destroyed by battle this turn. So this lets you preserve your level 2 or lower normal monsters on field, just sort of keeping your ranks even, so that way you can go for a Law of the Normal play later. Another normal monster adjacent card that is potentially here for like OTKs is Delta Attacker. This is a normal spell that says you can only activate this card while there are 3 normal monsters of the same name except tokens on your side of the field. The 3 normal monsters of the same name can attack your opponent's life points directly during the turn this card is activated. So this is sort of to play if you don't want to really use Law of the Normal. You can use this instead. Activate it on 3 normal monsters, and they don't have to be level 2 or lower, level 3 or lower. They just have to be 3 normal monsters. So this can pair with your Sonic Ducks, your Dragon Zombies, etc. And you can get in for a ton of damage if you do use those bigger cards. Also, if you just use things like 1,000 Energy or Triangle Power, this will also allow you to get in for a lot of damage that way. Although I think it is a little bit more situational than the other cards, which is kind of wild to say because those cards are already very situational. But I don't really think that this is better than them. I think it's honestly the worst of the sort of aggression bunch. But there are also some other cards here to pair with the normal monsters that actually, I think, are a little bit better than these sort of all-in aggressive strategies. The first being Order to Charge. This is a quick play spell that says target 1 non-token normal monster you control, tribute that normal monster, and if you do, destroy 1 monster your opponent controls. So this is a way to convert your weaker normal monsters into, damage, or not damage, but pops, so you actually hurt your opponent a little bit more. Now, unfortunately, this won't trigger Human Wave Tactics because you do tribute as opposed to destroying the card. But it is still good to convert a weak normal monster for a powerful monster that your opponent might have. We've also got Order to Smasher. This is a normal trap that says target 1 level 2 or lower non-token normal monster you control, tribute that monster, and if you do, destroy up to 2 spell or trap your opponent controls. So this is a good way to clear away your opponent's back row to stop whatever they might be doing with it. We've also got Dust Barrier here. Dust Barrier is a continuous spell that I don't really like, but it is a card to keep in mind if you are talking about these normal monsters. It says face-up normal monsters on the field are unaffected by your opponent's spell cards. This card is destroyed during your second standby phase after activation. The reason I don't really like this is because there's basically a better version of it in the form of non-spellcasting area. This is a continuous spell that has already been released. It was released in, I think, Dark Crisis, maybe? Or maybe Invasion of Chaos. It's been released in one of the past sets. And says all face-up monsters except for effect monsters are unaffected by other spell effects. Now, the issue with this is you might potentially want to go for something like 1,000 Energy or Triangle Power before going for Law of the Normal, and non-spellcasting area won't let you do that because it's also unaffected by your own spells, whereas Dust Barrier will let you do that. And if it's already being sent to the graveyard with something like Law of the Normal, then it's not really as bad that it gets sent after your second standby phase after activation. So that's where you're going to play this over non-spellcasting area. But I do think that if you are going for just a general normal monster strategy and not going for Law of the Normal, then I do think that non-spellcasting area is a bit better than Dust Barrier. Normal monsters also have their own Call of the Haunted, which is Soul Resurrection. This is a continuous trap that says activate this card by targeting one normal monster in your graveyard, special summon it in defense position. When this card leaves the field, destroy that monster. When that monster is destroyed, destroy this card. So this is kind of an anti-synergy with Law of the Normal, but it does have really good synergy with something like Oppressed People, which is a 2k defense normal monster. There also are other 2k defense normal monsters like Giant Silver Stone, Aquamador, etc. Basically, look at any Yugi Kaiba deck list if you want more ideas for 2k defense position monsters that you want to go with. But Dust Barrier, or not Dust Barrier, Soul Resurrection can be very good at just keeping bodies on board as well, and just walling off your opponent from actually attacking in while you set up your plays. Now, these are all cards that are spells and traps related to normal monsters, but there also are effect monsters that also are related to normal monsters. So the first of them being the Emissary of the Afterlife. This is the best of them, in my opinion. The level 4 Fiend, 1600 attack, 600 defense. It says when this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, each player adds one level 3 or lower normal monster from their deck to their hand. So this can be very good at sort of replenishing your normal monsters, getting out a ton of cards for Law of the Normal, potentially, just having them in hand. And it also does have another application in another deck, not going for this Law of the Normal stuff, but going for Exodia, because 4 of the 5 Exodia pieces are all normal monsters. So, if you want to search them out quickly, Emissary of the Afterlife gives you a way to do that. And this card is unlimited, unlike Witch and Sangan. So you can potentially loop it with Resurrection cards, potentially just play multiple of it to then just get those Exodia pieces in hand pretty quickly. So it's good to know for that. And also your opponent likely is not playing as many normal monsters, so the other part of the effect won't benefit them. Now, Spirit Color is another potentially decent card to get normal monster on your side of the field. It says flip, you can special summon one level 3 or lower normal monster from your graveyard to your side of the field. You can choose the battle position, so you can go for something defensive like an Oppressed People, or something offensive like a Sonic Duck. But this card is probably a little bit too slow to actually see play in these normal monster decks, but it is something good to know about. Also, there's Emissary of the Oasis. Emissary of the Oasis is a way to sort of protect your life points while you're setting up your plays. This is a level 3 spellcaster, 600 attack, 400 defense. It says while a face-up level 3 or lower normal monster is on your side of the field, your opponent cannot target this card for an attack. While this card is face-up on your side of the field, any battle damage to the controller of this card from battle involving a level 3 or lower normal monster, becomes 0. So that's a way to sort of keep yourself alive if your opponent's going for aggressive pushes. If you've got human wave tactics as well, then this can sort of be a soft lock if your opponent can't get enough monsters to actually deal with this. So that makes it kind of nice in that regard. There's also Man Throw, which can turn your normal monsters into burn damage. This is a 1000 attack, 1000 defense beast warrior monster, level 4. So by attributing one normal monster except a token on your side of the field, inflict 800 points of damage to your opponent's life points. So this can turn this into a burn spell. But again, it doesn't destroy, just like Order to Charge doesn't destroy, so it won't trigger your human wave tactics, which can make it a little bit harder to actually get a bunch of normal monsters that you need to actually deal the amount of damage to make this worth it. But it is a card to consider, I guess. It's just not very good in my opinion. But if you want to go more stall burn strategy with the normal monsters, then this is a card to consider. There's also a sort of boss monster for normal monster strategies. It's really, really bad. But it is something that you can potentially play. It's Spirit of the Pharaoh. Spirit of the Pharaoh is a level 6 zombie, 2500 attack, 2000 defense. Cannot be normal summoned or set. Must be special summoned by the first sarcophagus. And when this card is special summoned, you can target up to 4 level 2 or lower zombie normal monsters in your graveyard. Special summon those targets. The only targets at this point in the game are Pharaoh Servant and Pharaonic Protector, along with Skull Servant all the way back from LOB. So think about the payoff of this card. This is a card that, basically just fills up your field with a bunch of 900 attack monsters at best. And so you already have to have those 4 900 attack point monsters in graveyard before you go for this. So already the payoff is a little bit underwhelming. Only 2500 attack as well. But the real kicker is that its summoning technique is really, really awful. It's like there's almost no way to actually pull it off, because it has to be summoned with the first sarcophagus. The first sarcophagus is a continuous trap that says one per turn during your opponent's end phase. Place the second sarcophagus, or after you've done that, the third sarcophagus from your hand or deck in your spell and trap zone face up. Then if you control the first sarcophagus, the second sarcophagus, and the third sarcophagus, send all of them to the graveyard. And if you do, special summon one Spirit of the Pharaoh from your hand or deck. If any of these cards, including this card, leaves your field, send all of them you control to the graveyard, including this card. That's really bad. One MST just kills this entire combo. MST's at 3. Everyone's playing 3 copies of it. And like, you have to play bricks in your deck in the forms of the second sarcophagus and the third sarcophagus. Both of these are just continuous spells that do nothing. This card can only be placed on the field by the effect of the first sarcophagus, is their shared effect there. They're cool to look at, I guess. But yeah, you're never pulling this off. You'll never get all 3 of these out before your opponent actually has a way to deal with them. And, you know, even if you do, there's like 2 or 3 turns total to actually pull off this combo and bring out the Spirit of the Pharaoh. And when you do, the payoff is not really that good. So I don't really think this is worth playing if you're going for a normal monster strategy. It's just really, really bad. And there's no way that, probably one of the hardest summoning conditions to actually pull off for a monster at this point in the game's history. And that's saying something when you have things like Fushio Richie running around. So, you know, I don't really think this card is worth playing. Lastly, you know, there is one more normal monster that we should talk about here, which is Sealmaster Meisei. And the reason we should talk about this guy is that he actually has 2 cards devoted to him. So Sealmaster Meisei, level 3 monster, 1100 attack, 900 defense. And the reason why he's important is because there's a continuous spell and a continuous trap based around him. Continuous spell is Talisman of Trap Sealing. This is activate this card only if you control Sealmaster Meisei. Trap cards and their effects on field cannot be activated. Negate all traps effects on the field. If you do not control Sealmaster Meisei, destroy this card. Talisman of Spell Sealing is basically the same thing, but for spell cards. I think Talisman and Spell Sealing is a little bit better because you can activate it in response to your opponent's spell, which is basically like an IO at home. But, you know, if you've summoned out Sealmaster Meisei and set a bunch of back row, your opponent will likely have the read that you've got a Talisman and Spell Sealing set, and they'll just attack over Sealmaster Meisei. So it's not really that good, but it is potentially IO at home as opposed to Talisman and Trap Sealing. Now, these cards cannot be used at the same time, which is very silly to me, because, you know, it's like you want cards in your deck to have synergies with each other, and these have anti-synergies with each other. I guess the idea is that you can pick whichever one is more relevant to whatever deck you're facing. But, you know, even if that was a good way to play, Sealmaster Meisei itself is just such a bad card. 1100 attack is very, very weak in this format. There's so many things that get over this. And when they do get over this, it's basically a 2-for-1 if you've already activated your spell or your trap sealing. And it's just really bad, really, really fragile. You can only shut off one and not the other. So it's like you need multiple cards to actually set this up. So I think this deck is really bad if you are going for a Sealmaster Meisei deck. And these are the only 3 cards in it, really. You'd have to fill it up with everything else as well. So yeah, it's just really, really, really fragile. So I don't really think the Meisei strategy is the way to go. But it is interesting that this introduced this tech. I like the flavor of it at least. But it's not really that good in gameplay. But that's going to do it for the normal monsters of this set. There were some other assorted normal monsters that were released in this set that I didn't really talk about here because they didn't push the boundary of anything. They're just strictly worse than a lot of the cards that I've shown here. But I do think it's interesting that they sort of went this direction with a normal focused strategy here. I don't really think it's that good, but it is cool to see. And you will see a lot of the normal pop up at later times in the game's history, potentially, with people going for normal-based strategies like this and cards that can facilitate that. But it is very rare to see, and generally it's a pretty bad win con. But, you know, there were some other decks that were sort of bolstered by this But moving away from these specific strategies, there were a variety of other decks that were sort of benefited by the support that Ancient Sanctuary released. So let's dive into one sort of class of them, which is these sort of stall decks. So there are a variety of stall decks in the game's history at this point. Burn is a very common one. Wave Motion Cannon exists, and just stalling out the game to get a bunch of counters on Wave Motion can potentially get a Stealth Bird set up and deal burn damage that way is very nice. Empty Jar exists as well, which is more of a combo deck generally, but if you can't get started, then having these stall cards can be a very good backup plan. And you've also got Last Turn. Last Turn, you could call a combo deck because you're trying to pull off a combination of cards to beat your opponent. But since you do just sort of buy your time until you can get to that point, I do view it as a stall deck. And especially with some of the cards released in Ancient Sanctuary, it will definitely evolve more into a stall deck here. There are variations of these decks as well. But these are the main sort of categories of them. Exodia, I guess, is also a stall deck that I didn't mention here, but I mentioned it earlier in the video. And I think that it's honestly one of the worst of these stall decks. I think you have to be doing something a little bit different rather than just stalling and waiting for you to draw the pieces to actually make Exodia work. But there were some very powerful stall cards introduced in this set. The first of them being Wall of Revealing Light. This is a continuous trap that says activate by paying any multiple of 1,000 life points. Monster your opponent control cannot attack if their attack is less than or equal to the amount you paid. This is a great one-sided floodgate. Stops your opponent from attacking in and can be used reactively as well. The downside of this is you are paying a lot of life points to use it. So, you know, if you are playing a deck that really does need its life points, then this can be a bit iffy. But Ancient Sanctuary also released a variety of ways to gain back life points, which we'll talk about soon. And there are some decks that actually do want to be low. For instance, last turn, actually used Wall of Revealing Light both as a stall tool and as a combo piece, because if you need to get down to 1,000 life points or less, you can just flip up a Wall of Revealing Light, pay 7,000, and there you go. So, you know, Wall of Revealing Light, I think, is a very versatile card in a lot of stall engines, but arguably the better stall card in this set is actually Level Limit Area B. There's a continuous spell that says change all face-up level 4 or higher monsters to defense position. Doesn't cost life points, so that's pretty good. And also, you know, a lot of the burn decks or the empty jar decks or etc. aren't really attacking with like level 4 or above monsters here. So that can be a very good way to sort of stall out your opponent as well. It does lose to things like Imperial Order, which is annoying, but Imperial Order is a one of, and, you know, more likely these cards are going to lose to like MST, for instance. And yeah, that's just a flaw of all these sort of stall cards. But these two are definitely, they changed the name of the stall game in terms of like floodgates, and they definitely are the best floodgates, in my opinion, at this point in the game's history. There were some other sort of floodgates that you could play at this point that were released in this set. For instance, Death's Counterblow is a continuous trap to destroy any monster that inflicts battle damage to a player's life points by attacking directly. Not really the best floodgate because you still take the damage, but at least it's getting cards off your opponent's side of the field. And if you're playing a stall your deck, you probably aren't attacking into your opponent's stuff. So that means that you're not really losing much from this downside here. Judgment of the Desert is also kind of a floodgate if you pair it with certain things. There's a continuous trap that says the battle position of all face-up monsters that are flipped face-up. Activation of this card cannot be changed except with a card effect. And so what you could do is potentially play something like, oh, I guess it's only flipped up. I think that you could use something like Stumbling to then pair with it and have every monster that your opponent has just switch to defense, and then they can never switch them back. But this is only flip face up, so that means that the monsters have to be set in advance. So actually, this is not really a floodgate. Probably shouldn't be here in this section. Really bad card, but I mean, I don't know. It's just really bad. This actually, I mean, it doesn't really affect your empty jar decks that much because like you've got Book of Moon, Book of Taiyu, etc. to flip it down, and you know card effects can change the battle position, but this is just, yeah, it's really bad, I think. Yeah, so this card should not be here. It should probably be in the miscellaneous card section at the end of the video, but it is, you know, I'll leave it here, just to mark my mistake. But yeah, this is not a floodgate. Shouldn't be in any of these stall decks, really. Solar Flare Dragon can turn into a pseudo floodgate. It's a pyro monster, 1500 attack, 1000 defense, fire, level 4. It says while you control another pyro type monster, this card cannot be attacked during each of your end phases. Inflict 500 damage to your opponent, so it burns your opponent. Also, if you've got 2 of this card, it forms a soft lock where your opponent can't attack either because you control another pyro monster. And it's dealing 1,000 damage a turn. So that can be a decent setup for a burn deck just to sit on for a bit. If you want to lean more into the fire aspect for your burn deck, you've also got Backfire. There's a continuous trap that says if a face-up fire monster you control is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, inflict 500 damage to your opponent. So that's pretty good at burning your opponent to death as well. In terms of other monsters that can sort of stop your opponent from attacking in, you got the Unhappy Girl. This is a level 2 monster that says while this card is in face-up attack position on the field, this card is not destroyed as a result of battle. Damage calculation is applied normally though. A monster that battled with this card cannot change its battle position except with a card effect or attack while this card is in face-up attack position on the field. So basically what you can do is just, you know, camp this card in face-up attack position. Your opponent attacks into it to deal damage, but then they can't attack again with those monsters. I don't really think this is that good because it's basically like taking a bunch of direct attacks because this monster's attack is so low that it doesn't really stop the damage that you're taking. And your opponent likely will draw into an out for this eventually. Like DD Warrior Lady is an out to this that attacks into it, banishes both, and there you go. So I don't really think this is a great stall tool, but it is a potential one if you want to go for that. And if you do have ways to protect this thing, then maybe it could potentially be good. But I don't really think this card is worth playing in more stall-focused decks. Next up, you've got Stone Statue of the Aztecs. This is mainly here because it's a 2K defender. There are plenty of 2K defenders in this format, but if you are playing a burn deck, then this card's effect could actually come up as well. So it's double any battle damage your opponent takes when they attack this monster. So that if they attack into this with something like a Witch of the Black Forest or a DD Warrior Lady, then they're taking over 1,000 damage from this attack, which is pretty good. So, it's not the best thing in the world. Like, there are ways to get around 2K defenders in this format, at least, but it is something, and at least it deals some amount of burn damage, in addition to the battle damage that your opponent would normally take. Next up, we got Rocket Jumper. Rocket Jumper is here because it pairs very well with Level Limit Area B. Rocket Jumper is a level 3, 1,000 attack point monster that says, if the only cards on your opponent's side of the field are defense position monsters, this card can attack your opponent's life points directly, which is very, very nice. If you've got Level Limit Area B, switching all your opponent's monsters to defense, this is basically a burn spell for 1,000 every turn, so that's pretty good. And maybe burn decks would play this if they are maxing out in level limit area B. Next up, we got Atomic Firefly. This is a level 1 insect that says when this face-up card on the field attacks or is attacked and is destroyed as a result of battle, the player who destroyed it takes 1,000 points of damage. Now, this kind of like Unhappy Girl means that you're probably going to be taking a fair amount of damage off it because you have to have this face-up when it is attacked. And so you can't just set it and then have it flip face-up during damage calc. Doesn't quite work that way with this card. So I think this card is not really that good for a burn deck. There are other better ways to deal 1,000 damage, but it is something to consider, and at least you can get proactive with it, normal something it out, crashing into your opponent's monster, and dealing with it that way. It also does get around DD Warrior Lady, which is kind of funny. It just says if it's destroyed as a result of battle, not that it's sent to the graveyard. So, you can use it even if your opponent has a DD Warrior Lady, so that's kind of nice as well. It is a light as well, I guess, so, if you're going for a Chaos Burn strategy, this card can support that as well. Next up, we've got KA2 Death Scissors and Needle Burrower. Both of these monsters have the same effect, just different stats. KA2 Death Scissors is a level 4 monster with 1,000 attack, 1,000 defense. Says when this card destroys a monster and sent to the graveyard as a result of battle, inflict damage to your opponent's life points equal to the level of the destroyed monster by 500 points. So, that's pretty good if it can actually get over something, but with 1,000 attack, it's probably not going to do that. Needle Burrower is little bit more likely to get over that. It's got 1,700 attack, so, there are more things that it can get over. But when you have things at a baseline of like 1,800 with Kaiku, for instance, then having a 1 tribute 1,700 attack point monster is not really that good, even if you're going for this effect. And, it can deal like 1,500 damage potentially if it attacks into like a Sangan, which is pretty good. But like most of the time, you're not going to be attacking over level 4 monsters that will be destroyed and sent to the graveyard. So I don't really think that these two cards are very good here, but they do technically fit into the burn label. Also, there's Manthro, which I talked about in the normal monster section. I'm not really going to talk about it here. I think this card's pretty bad for a general burn deck. There's also Goblin Thief, which is kind of interesting. Inflicts 500 points of damage to your opponent's life points and also increases your life points by 500 points. And there are potential burn cards that do burn your opponent for when you increase your life points, namely Fire Princess, which, Princess Burn is a subsection of burn that you can potentially play. Not really as good as regular burn, but it is something at least. And Goblin Thief is kind of cool because it will turn that burn damage and the healing damage into burn. So this is 1,000 points total if you've got Fire Princess on field, which is pretty cool. There's also Dora of Fate. Dora of Fate is really bad. Normal trap says you can only activate this card during your opponent's turn. Select one face-up monster on your opponent's side of the field. When you normal summon a monster that is 1 level lower than the selected monster during your next turn, inflict damage to your opponent's life points equal to the level of the selected monster times 500. That is very, very specific. You need to both target an opponent's monster and also have a monster in your hand with 1 level less than it. And you need to normal summon that next turn. And that is a lot of things to sort of keep in mind there. It locks you into one play for your next turn, basically, if you want to actually get value off it. And most of the time, what you'll be doing is targeting a level 4 monster, bring out a level 3 monster, and then, your opponent will take 2,000, which is nice, but, you've had to commit your level 3 monster that you might not have wanted to commit otherwise. And in a worst case scenario, your opponent has like a really big monster, like, BLS, and you don't have any level 7 monsters to actually bring out off this. So you can't really use this on everything, and it's just very, very niche, I think. So not really the best card, but it is kind of cool to deal like 2,000 if you can pull that off. So, it could potentially see play, I think. Next up, we've got very situational cards. We've got Elephant Statue of Disaster and Elephant Statue of Blessing. These are cards that deal damage and gain you damage, respectively, if they are sent from your hand to the graveyard by an opponent's effect. The cards that would actually do this are most likely to be Delinquent Duo and Chaos Emperor Dragon. Those are the two cards that see consistent play in regular Chaos format that would actually trigger these potentially. But, realistically, you only really care about Duo because if your opponent's going for a Chaos Ember Dragon effect, you're probably losing the game at that point either way. So you want to actually be able to use the effect of Elephant Statue of Disaster or Elephant Statue of Blessing to then manipulate the life points further. Duo is kind of nice because, like, if they hit, for instance, an Elephant Statue of Disaster, now they're down 3,000 life points instead of just 1,000. So that's pretty good. But, Elephant Statue of Blessing, I don't really think the 2,000 gain is that worth it. But I guess it can insulate you against more aggressive plays. But you might be wondering why I'm mentioning these here as opposed to the general good card section, because this can be used as just a general sort of tech against decks that are trying to discard cards from your hand. And the reason I'm mentioning it here is because I think there are better cards to use instead. Scissor Serpent, I think, is a much better card to play instead, like if you're worried about Delinquent Duo or Chaos Ember Dragon. And most of the time, if you have a card in hand, it probably won't be getting ripped out of your hand with a Duo. Duo is a one-of, so, it can come up, but, like, you've got to expect that most of the cards in your deck in a given game are not going to get ripped out of your hand with Duo. And, if they're not ripped out of your hand with Duo, I think that most of the cards in your deck that you're playing will probably convert to around 2,000 or more points of damage, depending on how you play them. So, this isn't quite always the case, but, like, I do think that most cards can just do that and be more versatile in general, rather than just hoping to draw one of these cards when your opponent has a Duo. And if they don't have Duo, then you just sort of waste a card here. So I don't really think these cards are that good, and that's why I didn't really discuss them in the generically good card section. But they are kind of interesting, I think. And in a more burn-focused deck, maybe you are more worried about hand rips, so you go for this to sort of punish your opponent for doing that. But I think, honestly, if you were playing a card like this, you'd probably want to play Electric Snake over these, and that card is really not good either. Next up, we've got Blessing the Nile, which kind of pairs with these cards, or it's a similar sort of thing. It says each time cards are discarded from your hand to the graveyard by the effect of a card controlled by your opponent, increase your life points by 1,000 points. Now, this, I think, is slightly better than the two elephant statues, because in this case, it also applies to confiscation. Doesn't apply to Chaos Ember Dragon, but like I mentioned with the other cards here, if your opponent's going for the Chaos Ember Dragon effect, you're probably just losing the game at that point anyways, before any effects can be activated. So, I think having a way to make things like confiscation or Delinquent Duo a bit worse for your opponent is kind of nice. But at the same time, if your opponent sees this on your side of the field, then they won't activate those cards. So, I don't really think it's good in that way. I guess, this pairs with Mirage of Nightmare. So that's something. If you have activated Mirage of Nightmare and Blessing the Nile at the same time. Oh, no, it's just the opponent. So actually that doesn't work. Yeah, so just paired with those, I guess card destruction as well. But yeah, I don't really think that these cards are that good. I think they're very, very situational, and most of the time you want more versatile cards than cards that are very, very niche, and niche for specific situations that will rarely come up while you have these cards, and if they do, it's not even that good of a gain. So I don't really think these cards are worth playing. But if we're talking about cards that gain you life points for the Fire Princess strat, there are a couple others in this form besides Blessing the Nile. Mystic Walk I talked about earlier. I think this is one of the best life point gain cards in the format, although it is probably better in a Scientist deck than a Princess Burn deck. But it is still gaining you life points. Draining Shield, again, can also gain you life points too. This is probably the best card for Princess Burn that they got here, as it protects their monsters as well, which is pretty good. Also, White Magician Pikaru is a monster that can gain you life points too for every monster that you have on your side of the field by 400 during your standby phase. So there's that too. 7 is a very interesting continuous spell. It says when there are 3 face-up 7 cards on your side of the field, draw 3 cards from the deck, then destroy all 7 cards. When this card is sent directly from the field to the graveyard, increase your life points by 700 points. So, the ideal would be to activate all 3 sevens, draw 3 cards, then gain 2,100 life points. But even if your opponent actually managed to clear a 7 away, like maybe you have 2 sevens on field and your opponent's getting scared, they're going to activate that third one. They go for like an MST to hit one of the 7s. You at least gain 700 life points, pair with your Fire Princess a little bit. So, there is that. I don't really think this card's that good though, because it is very sort of like dependent on luck, like what you draw. And there are ways for your opponent to disrupt it, as I mentioned. But it is kind of interesting to see, at least. Moving on from the burn strategies, I want to mention Empty Jar, because Empty Jar did get some very, very good tools as well. Namely, Desert Sunlight and Desert Taper are also just very, very good cards. So Desert Sunlight is a normal strat that says all monsters on your side of the field are changed to face-up defense position. This can basically be like a pseudo Book of Tayu if you have a couple turns of setup. You can set Desert Sunlight, use it to flip up something like a Morphing Jar, or, Cyber Jar, etc. and then get those draws off. But also it can be used defensively if your opponent goes for Nobleman of Crossout. Use Desert Sunlight to flip up your jar, dodge around that, and then use the effect. And if you also flip up a Desert Taper at the same time, then Desert Taper can be used to target the jar and flip it back down, because this is a flip monster that says flip one face-up monster on the field into face-down defense position. You cannot select Desert Taper. So it's a kind of cool way to get off potentially multiple jars with like one Desert Sunlight. So that's kind of cool. It is kind of situational though. I'd probably just play the Desert Sunlight instead of the Desert Taper, but it is a cool card to know about. Night Assailant, as I mentioned earlier, is a great card in this deck because you're discarding cards off Morphing Jar, and also this allows you to get back flip monsters, so that's pretty good as well. The one downside is that oftentimes you want flip monsters in grave for things like Shallow Grave, but you know, getting back something like another Night Assailant can be good, and just having more cards in hand for your own card destruction, if you do need to use it to draw deeper into your deck, can be good as well. Next up, we got Soul Reversal. This is a quick play spell. This says return one flip effect monster from your graveyard to the top of your deck. This can be good to reuse your jars a bit. It is a bit slower than a lot of the other cards like Shallow Grave, etc. But it is potentially a card you could use. It's just, I think, kind of underwhelming for the empty jar deck in particular, but it is something that you can definitely experiment with, especially if you're building a slower version of empty jar. Next up, we've got Soul Absorbing Bone Tower. This card is really bad in empty jar because there's so few zombie monsters that you can use to do it, but it does pair with mill strategies, so I figured I'd mention it here. It says if you control another zombie monster, your opponent cannot target this card for attacks. Each time a zombie type monster is special summoned, send the top two cards of your opponent's deck to graveyard. So this is another way to mill your opponent out, but unfortunately milling your opponent is not actually the best unless you're going for like an empty jar strategy, because you really do need to just get rid of your opponent's deck in one go, because giving your opponent graveyard setup is pretty good for them. So I don't really think that this card's that good, although you can actually get off a lot of mills off something like a Pyramid Turtle or a Book of Life, etc. So there is that at least. But this card is just generally bad otherwise. Now, for some other cards that you might want to consider if you're going for a burn deck, there's Nubian Guard and Oswan Apparition. These two cards are very similar. They're both very, very weak monsters with 500 attack, 500 defense. Nubian Guard is a warrior that says if this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent's life points, you can return one continuous spell card from your graveyard to the top of your deck. This can be used to recycle things like a Wave Motion Cannon or a Level Limit Area B. So it's got some versatility there, and can just refuel your sort of stalling, your burning, etc. Osman Apparition is very similar. If it inflicts battle damage to your opponent's life points, you can return one trap card from your graveyard to the top of your deck. This can be used in the, sort of burn and empty jar decks, like I mentioned, impact things like Wall of Revealing Light or Gravity Bind. But it can also be used in last turn decks. If your opponent sniped the last turn that you had, then you can go for the other last turn, or add the last turn back to the top of your deck, that is, and sort of recover from that loss a little bit. So these are two cards to potentially consider. I don't really think they're the best, but they are potential ways to sort of keep your stall decks alive for a little bit longer. So it is something to potentially consider. But that's going to do it for the more stally burn cards or empty jar cards or whatever degenerate strategy you might have in mind. I sort of grouped a bunch of cards here that probably shouldn't have been clustered in this list here, but that's mainly because I wanted to make this next section a little bit shorter than it otherwise will be. And that next section is sort of just the miscellaneous cards that I couldn't really fit into any other section of the video. So get ready to experience a lot of ranting at Konami's really weird design decisions. So let's dive into that now. Now, I was tempted to put some of these cards in their own section because they do, some of them at least, support previous strategies that have been introduced. But when I say support previous strategies, I think that's a very loose sort of way of framing it. And realistically, I would honestly say there's only really like one card here that supports a specific strategy that's already been released. So I decided to just lump them all together in this miscellaneous cards section of the video. And my golly, what a selection of miscellaneous cards these are, because there's some definitely really weird ones here. Let's start out with some of the best of the miscellaneous cards that I just couldn't really fit in anywhere else. Firstly, we got King of the Swamp. King of the Swamp is actually a good card for the decks it's built for. This is a level 3 Aqua type monster, 500 attack, 1100 defense. It says this card in your hand, field, or graveyard can be used as a substitute for any one fusion material whose name is mentioned on the fusion material card, or fusion monster card, but the other materials must be correct. You can discard this card to the graveyard, add one polymerization from your deck to your hand. This card is really, really versatile in any deck that wants to fusion summon, because, it can serve as a fusion material, or it can serve as a way to get to polymerization, which is a very hard card to find in a lot of these fusion decks. Also, if you have a way to add it back to your hand with something like Salvage, for instance, then you get back that fusion material to use with the polymerization that you searched already. So this card is really, really good. And if you are going for a salvage build of it, you can potentially make Last Warrior from another planet. because, Mariokutai is 900 attack water, so you can go for that sort of thing, but you can also just go for Zambira as well if you want to do that. I think, honestly, like, the main fusion deck at this point in the game is probably that Last Warrior from Another Planet deck. The Last Warrior from Another Planet is a good fusion monster, and also its materials are not bad either. But fusion monster decks are kind of not really the best in this format, so I don't really think we'll see play, but for decks that do want a fusion summon, this is the best thing they could have asked for. So, this is actually a really good card for what it is. Since it's a water, let's just segue into the other water monsters that were released in this format, or this set. We got Mermaid Knight coming up first. This is also a pretty good card. It's a level 4 water. 1500 attack, 700 defense. Says while Umi is face up on the field, this card can attack twice during the same battle phase. So by Umi, it means Legendary Ocean. You're never really going to be playing Umi. You're always probably going to be playing Legendary Ocean because it's generally better. And, with that on field, this is a 3400 attack total of damage. So that's pretty good to just get aggressive with this deck. Having a 1700 attack point monster that can hit it twice is pretty decent. And if we're talking about other monsters that can start pumping up the damage for the water deck, we've also got Piranha Army. This is a level 2 water, 800 attack, 200 defense. It says the battle damage this card inflicts by attacking your opponent's life points directly is doubled. This card is really interesting, dealing 1600 base if it attacks directly, but if Legendary Ocean is on field, it deals 2000 damage, which means that there's a lot of things you can do to continue buffing this up. Also, if it is level 1 when Legendary Ocean is on field, then you can pair it with Optic Camouflage Armor. This is an equipped spell that says you can only equip this card to a level 1 monster. A monster equipped with this card can attack your opponent's life points directly. So that pairs very well with Legendary Ocean because this will drop down to level 1. You equip Optic Camouflage Armor. That's 2,000 damage total. And that's just from that. You can also equip other spells to it, like Axe of Despair, Stand, Mage Power, etc. And then you've got a pseudo OTK on your hands. Mage Power might actually make it a full OTK because you've already got 2 other spells base for it. So that's 1,500 damage. So ultimately, this thing is 3,500 attacking in at that point, and that's 7,000 damage total. So, I think that this card is a potential way to, build an OTK deck if you want to build a water OTK deck. But it is, kind of tough. It requires a lot of moving pieces, and there are some things that can stop it, like MST and other things like that. So, good to keep in mind if you want to go for this more janky OTK strategy. But I think in general, it's not really that good. Next up, we got the zombie support. And the reason I'm putting that in quotations is because these monsters are all zombies. And zombies do have Pyramid Turtle and Book of Life to sort of, tie the strategy together, but these cards don't really pair well as a whole. First up, we got Regenerating Money. This is a level 4 zombie. 1800 attack, 1500 defense. It says when this card is sent from your hand to your graveyard by an opponent's card effect, return this card to the hand. This can pair well, against Chaos Emperor Dragon, which is pretty good. I think this is probably, if you're playing a card like Elephant Statue of Disaster or Blessing to get around Chaos Emperor Dragon, you want to probably use Regenerating Mummy as, 800 attack is nothing to scoff at after CD activation. But again, if your opponent is CDing, they're probably winning the game at that point. So, it's not really the best in that regards. This card also pairs against like hand rips like Duo, but besides like Duo and CD, there aren't really many uses for this effect. Still, 1800 attack is nothing to scoff at for a zombie deck. Pretty good stat there. Double Costin is another zombie. 1700 attack, 1650 defense. This card can be treated as 2 tribute summons for the tribute summon of a dark monster. So this can be used as a 1-card Demock, potentially, if you're playing Demock. If you're keeping it in the zombie engine, Despair from the Dark can be summoned out off this. So that's kind of nice as well. But in general, like tribute summoning a level 7 or 8 monster is not the best. Unless there are very good 7 and 8 monsters, but a lot of the time, you're not really going to get to the point where you can actually tribute some of them out. Now, Pyramid Turtle makes it a little bit easier because if your opponent attacks into a Pyramid Turtle, you bring out a Double Costin, then hard tribute out like a Demock or a Despair from the Dark. That's pretty good. But if you don't have that set up exactly, then those Democks and Despair from the Dark can rot in your hand a little bit. So I think this card is maybe not the best, but it is potentially a way to make this strategy a little bit more consistent. Next up, we have Vampire Lady, based off Vampire Lord. This is a level 4, 1550 attack, 1550 defense zombie monster. It says if this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, declare 1 card type, monster, spell, or trap. Your opponent selects or sends 1 card of that type from their deck to the graveyard, just like Vampire Lord does. That is the worst part of the Vampire Lord effect, and that's the only effect this card has. So this card is really bad. The stat line's not good. The effect to, Foolish Burial, a card in your opponent's deck, is not good because they get to pick what card they send. So, this card is just really, really bad. Next up, we get the Kickman. This is to pair with the Chopman, and this is a level 3 zombie. 1300 attack, 300 defense. Says when this card is special summoned, you can equip one appropriate equip spell from your graveyard to this card. That is potentially a decent effect, because, you can have powerful equip spells that you equip to this, and that's pretty decent. But it takes a very specific deck to actually pull this off, and I'm pretty sure this card might not be activatable in the damage step, I think. I could be wrong about that. Let me know down in the comments below if you actually know. But if it can be activated in the damage step, that's really bad, because the ideal thing would be to bring out off a Pyramid Turtle, then get an equip spell back off that, summon. But if you can't activate in the damage step, you can't use it at that timing. So that'd be pretty bad. But yeah, in an equipped focused deck, this card could potentially be good. It's just the hard part is finding a way to special summon it consistently. And also, it's only got 1300 attack, so even if you equip something like, an Axe of Despair, it's only got 2300, one attack, you're probably more, suited to using a high boost knight or something like that. You can actually take advantage of, more equipped spells on it. Next up, we got Protector of the Sanctuary. This card is interesting. It actually was on the ban list at one point, which is kind of cool. This card is a Fiend, 1100 attack, 1900 defense. Says your opponent cannot draw cards except during draw phases. So the idea behind this card, and what makes it potentially degenerate enough to land on the ban list, is that, you pair this with a card like Card Destruction or something like that, or Morphing Jar, and, your opponent can't draw off those effects. So they're basically losing their entire hand, and you're getting into a pretty good position. However, you can't actually activate something like Card Destruction when this card is face up on the field, because, you can't activate a card that can't actually do its full effect there. You can indeed activate something like Morphing Jar. Morphing Jar can be used because the flip summon of it, triggers the flip effect, and flip summoning, can obviously be done regardless of this card being on the field. But, it's just you need that Morphing Jar to actually pull that off. And I think in general, if you're playing a Morphing Jar combo deck to actually pull that off, you probably want to be playing Empty Jar. Now, there are some ways around this, though. If you activate something like Card Destruction and then you go for a Call of the Haunted to bring this thing back, then the Card Destruction will be able to, continue its activation because it's part of the chain. And your opponent will lose all the cards in their hand, which is pretty nice. You can also use this paired with Call of the Haunted to stop something like your opponent's Graceful Charity, for instance, because they activate Graceful, you chain Call of the Haunted, bring back this. They then can't draw off the Charity, which is pretty good. I'm actually unsure if they'd actually then discard off the Charity. That's an interesting question to consider as well. That would be really good, because then that would turn Charity into a -3, which is kind of funny. But yeah, this card is very interesting, but I don't really think it's as good as being on the ban list might make it imply. But it is kind of cool that you can pull off those sorts of combos. Next up, we got the really bad cards. These cards have almost no merit to them. First up, we got 3 Amplicuda. This is a level 3 beast. Effect monster, 500 attack, 1500 defense. Says if there are 3 face-up 3 Amplicuda cards on your side of the field, tribute 2 of them to draw 3 cards. So, you need to set up a really convoluted board state where you have 3 Amplicudas. All these cards are pretty bad, so they're likely not going to be able to stick around on field that easily. And then when you actually have all 3 of them set up, you contribute 2 to draw 3 cards. And that's basically going net neutral in card advantage, because you've used 3 cards to draw 3 cards. To be fair, you've got a monster on field, so it's not quite net neutral. You kind of are slightly ahead. But you've also committed a normal summon to this thing at one point, and this card is so useless on field that it might as well not be on field. So it basically is net neutral in card advantage, and you've got to play these bricks in your deck to actually pull it off. You have to have some ways to protect this thing, and while you're setting up the combo as well. This card, really, really bad. It's just awful. It's a really bad card. And you'll likely never actually be able to pull this off at this point in the game. Next up, we've got the Arcane Archer of the Forest, level 3 warrior type monster. While there's a plant type monster on your side of the field, this card cannot be attacked. And then by tributing 1 plant type monster on your side of the field, destroy 1 spell or trap card on the field. I don't know why, but Konami, early in the game's history, just made some monsters to pair with plant monsters when there were no plant monsters in the game. There are legitimately no good plant monsters in the game at this point, except for Mystic Tomato. But even then, that's sort of fallen out of favor in a lot of decks. And, tributing off a Mystic Tomato to pop a back row is, probably not the best use of that Mystic Tomato if you are going for that. Yeah, there's no really, plant deck at this point in the game, as you might consider it. You could potentially go for, a Lacunga deck, I guess, because I believe that's a plant. Actually, that might be an Aqua. Let me just check Lacunga, actually. But I'm pretty sure that it doesn't work. No, it's a plant. Okay, so you can go for a Lakunga strategy with Arcane Archer of the Forest. That could actually be pretty good. But in general, like, that's very convoluted. This card only has 900 attack, 1400 defense. And if your opponent had back row that actually did something, they'd probably use it before actually, getting popped by that. And you also have to be committed to a water deck to play the Lakunga with the Arcane Archer of the Forest. And at that point, it's just like you're in too deep. You cook too much. So I don't really think that that is the best here, unfortunately. But next up, we've got a card that is somehow probably even worse, and that is Avatar of the Pot. The level 3 monster, 1200 attack, 1300 defense, says by sending one Pot of Greed from your hand to the graveyard, draw 3 cards from your deck. So you're basically turning a Pot of Greed, which draws you 2, and thus is a +1, into kind of a +1. Because, again, like with 3 Amplicuda, this card's basically useless on the field. So essentially, you're using 2 cards to draw 3 cards, so it's still a +1. It's not quite a +1, I understand, because you do have this card on the field. But this card is useless on the field. This card really bad. 1200 attack, 1300 defense, not good stats. And, if you don't have Pot of Greed, this card is not going to be useful at all. Now, potentially you could loop the Pot of Greed with something like Magician of Faith to then get more activation of this. Also, this allows you to draw through IO. So that's good as well, because Imperial Order would shut down the Pot of Greed. But it can't shut down Avatar of the Pot. So, there's that. But I think overall, this card is just not worth playing for the 1 of Pot of Greed in your deck. It is kind of cool that it exists though, and I love the art. It's just very funny to see Pot of Greed going crazy on a monster like that, but I just think this card is not worth playing. Next up, we got Disc Fighter, level 4 Earth, 1000 attack, 1000 defense. If this card attacks a defensive monster with 2000 defense or more, destroy the monster with this card's effect without applying damage calculation. Not a terrible effect, but it's just very situational. Not really good attack stats here. Also, DD Warrior Lady can deal with that a lot better oftentimes. But, who knows? With Gravekeeper Spy seeing more play recently, maybe this card will see playing in the side deck. I don't know. This card just generally probably pretty bad and not really worth playing, even as a side deck tech, even for a more devoted warrior deck even. Next up, we got Gear Golem, the Moving Fortress, the level 4 machine, 800 attack, 2200 defense. It says once per turn during your main phase 1, pay 800 life points. This card can attack your opponent directly this turn. So the big thing here is 2200 defense. I think that is the most defense on a level 4 or lower monster up to this point in the game, which is kind of cool. That has like no downsides to it. The attacking thing probably won't come up. I can't really see it being that important, because if you switch this thing to attack, then, it's more vulnerable. Like, the point of this thing is being a defensive wall, and the 800 attack directly is not really going to be that good. You're also going even on this. Like, you and your opponent are losing the same amount of life points if it does go through. And that's not counting the life points that you're going to be taking from whatever monster attacked the thing on the following turn. So I don't really think that this is that good. Next up, we got Ghost Knight of Jackal, level 5 Earth monster, 1700 attack, 1600 defense. It says when this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, you can target that destroyed monster in your opponent's graveyard. Spell summon that target to your field in defense position. This is basically like an OG version of Goyo Guardian, but it's really bad. 1700 attack is not enough to get over anything that you'd actually want to bring back to your side of the field in defense. You could bring back like Sangan, Witch, Mystic Tomato, etc. But most of the time, you're not going to be wanting to bring back whatever they destroy. Sinister Serpent is actually probably the main card that you do that with, but everything else is not really that good. I mean, I guess, you could deprive your opponent of like a Light Engrave if, you hit over a Magician of Faith, for instance. But still, it's very situational at that point, and also your opponent has to not have a way to deal with Ghost Knight of Jackal or the monster that you bring back to then put it in grave. Now, I do think this is interesting, but I don't really think it's worth playing over a myriad of other, like, 1 tribute monsters. I mean, Zaborg is in this format. Like, that is instantly better than this. And yeah, so it's not really that good here. Next up, we get Goblin King, level 1 Fiend, 0 attack, 0 defense. When you control another Fiend monster, monsters cannot attack this card. This card's attack and defense become the number of other Fiend monsters on the field times 1000. So in order to get this thing up to 2000 attack, which I think is the first sort of reasonable attack stat that makes this decent, you have to have 3 monsters on your side of the field. 2 of them have to be Fiends. It's just a really big ask. You need to, especially in a format with like Raigeki and Dark Hole, etc. So I don't really think that this card is that good. You could pair it with something like a Goblin Attack Force at least to like wall your opponent out a little bit, I guess, because it's hard to get over Goblin Attack Force. But it just takes too long to actually set up, and it's not really a good enough payoff for when you do, because ultimately this card is only a 2000 to 3000 attack point monster most of the time, and that there are too many ways to deal with that. Next up, we got Grave Protector, another fiend that says any monster destroyed by battle is shuffled into the deck instead of going to the graveyard. That is a very interesting effect. It can stop things like Sangam with the Black Forest. It can also prevent your opponent from getting a lot of graveyard setup, which is pretty good as well. However, there already exist cards that do similar things. Banish to the Light is one of them that banishes cards instead of just shuffling them back into the deck. You could argue that with Dimension Fusion around, this card is better than that because, your opponent won't be filling up their banish pile for a Dimension Fusion. But I still think this card isn't really worth playing enough to be here. Next up, we got Lady Ninja Yai, another addition to the burgeoning ninja archetype. Level 3 wind monster, 1100 attack, 200 defense. By discarding one wind monster from your hand to the graveyard, return all spell and trap cards to your opponent or on your opponent's side of the field to the owner's hand. So this is basically a giant Trinade on legs. And the unfortunate thing is you need to discard a wind monster. There aren't really many good wind monsters in this format. I guess if you're playing a devoted warrior deck, you can potentially search out like Sasuke Samurai with something like a Reinforce the Army. Use that as discard fodder for this. But I think in general, this card doesn't have enough attack. It's just using too many cards to act as a giant Trinade. I think it's not really that good. But there is another card that sort of pairs with this and the other ninjas that have been released so far, and that is Ninjutsu Art of Transformation. Ninjutsu Art of Transformation is a continuous strat. This is activate this card by attributing one face-up ninja monster, special summon one beast, wing beast, or insect monster from your deck or hand whose level is less than or equal to the level of the attributed monster had on field plus 3. When this card leaves the field, destroy that monster. So this may seem pretty good at first glance because you're like, oh, you can get out a powerful monster from deck with this. However, there are very few monsters that actually fit this criteria at this point in the game's history. The best one is probably Big Koala, which is a 2700 attack point, level 7 monster. But to do that, you actually need to tribute a level 4 ninja, of which you only really have Strike Ninja. So, if you tribute Strike Ninja, go for like a Big Koala, that's okay. You've committed a lot into just bringing out a 2700 attack point monster that dies to MST. You also have to play that brick in your deck as well. But, if you want to use Lazy Ninja Yai or below, you're not going to be really getting the most powerful monsters that you can. Now, you could just get out like a level 4 monster if you want. Like, that's fine. But, like, using this convoluted combo to then get out like a level 4 beast monster is not really that good. So I don't really think that this is that good at this point in the game's history. Maybe as more powerful cards come out, this will get better. But at this point, not really worth it. Next up, we got Legacy Hunter, level 4 warrior type monster. When this card attacks a face down defense position monster and destroys it and sends it to the graveyard as a result of battle, your opponent returns one random card from their hand to their deck. Their deck is then shuffled. I mean, this is okay, I guess, if you actually pull it off, but it's just very, very situational. 1,000 attacks, probably not going to be destroying too much. Especially a face down defense position monster. The only ones that are really going to be destroying are Magician of Faith and Sangan. Both of those add back cards from graveyard to hand or deck to hand. And so they're kind of going like neutral on that interaction because they're gaining card but then losing card as well. So you're not really getting too much of an advantage out of this. Now, it could potentially work if you like Book of Moon down an opponent's like Keiki the Ghost Destroyer or something like that. But a lot of level 4 monsters do have 1,000 or more defense. So it's not really even that good in that regard too. So, and 1,000 attack is just very, very vulnerable in this format. So I don't really think Legacy Hunter is that good here. Next up, we got Sand Gambler. This is a light spellcaster, 300 attack, 1,500 defense. Says toss a coin 3 times. If all 3 results are head, destroy all monsters on your opponent's side of the field. If all 3 results are tails, destroy all monsters on your side of the field. You can only activate this effect once per turn during your main phase. This is, it's a gamble card, so it could be really good if you hit all 3 heads, which is going to happen 1/8 of the time, and it can be really bad if, honestly, if any other result happens, because, let's say even if you don't hit 3 tails, but you don't hit 3 heads, you just have a weak monster on your side of the field that isn't doing anything. So I don't really think this card is that good. And even at best, like if you destroy all your opponent's monsters, it's kind of tough to capitalize on that when you've just got a 300 attack point monster attacking in. You could have other monsters as well to attack in, which is good. But I think in general, it's going to be a little bit iffy. So I'm not really a big fan of this card. It is a light monster though, so you could potentially play it for that reason. Next up, we got Sonic Jammer, a wind level 2 machine, 350 attack, 650 defense. It says flip, your opponent cannot activate any spell cards until the end of the end phase of the next turn. So, this can potentially insulate you from whatever powerful spells your opponent might use. Something like, Dark Hole, Regeki, Pot of Greed, etc. All that stuff can be stopped by Sonic Jammer. But to get full value out of this, you kind of have to flip up on your turn. If your opponent flips up on their turn, then, they can't use spells during your next turn. But at the end of your next turn, they can go back to using spells. So really, it only stops like MST in that case. And yeah, so that's not really that good. But it is an interesting card at least. So, and if you can preserve it on your side of the field to flip up on your turn, then that can be pretty decent, shutting down your opponent's turn. But yeah, I think this card is generally pretty bad though. Next up, we got Theban Nightmare. Theban Nightmare is a very interesting card. Level 4 Light Fiend, 1500 attack, 500 defense, says gains 1500 attack while you have no cards in your hand nor in your spell and trap zones. So the main use of this card is to have in your deck, lurking for if your opponent goes for a Chaos Ember Dragon play, and then you're in top deck mode, and you top deck this card, play it 3000 attack point body on a very simplified game state. So that's pretty good. It's also light to fuel your graveyard for your Chaos stuff. I think in general, it's way too situational. You're realistically not going to wind up in that situation unless your opponent's gone for a CD play. And even if they've gone for CD play, you have no guarantee to draw this. Also, you're probably going to lose the game if they've gone for a CD play. So I don't really think this card is that good, but it is interesting to see here. And maybe could see some play if people are daring enough to play it. Next up, we got 2000 Needles, which is a level 5 Earth monster. 2000 attack, 1800 defense. Says when this defense position monster is attacked, and the attack of the attacking monster is lower than the defense for this card, destroy the attacking monster at the end of the damage step. This is very similar to 1000 Needles, which is basically a level 4 version of this. 1000 attack, 1800 defense, same effect. I don't think you needed to make this a tribute monster, because the point of the tribute monster would be either to have a better effect, which it doesn't, have better defense, which it doesn't, or have better attack and just like serve as a beat stick, which it does have better attack, but you want to use this defensively so that way your opponent loses monsters. But I don't know, it's just a very, very weird card. 1000 Needles already doesn't see any play. I don't think this will see any play either. Next up, we got the spells, and the spells are kind of weird here. Very specific in a lot of cases. First up, we get Amplifier, an equipped spell that only equips to Jinzo. This card's activation effect cannot be negated. The equipped monster's effect, trap cards, and the effects on field cannot be activated. Negate all traps effects on field. Becomes your opponent cannot activate trap cards or their effects on the field. Negate all trap effects your opponent controls. When this card leaves the field, destroy the equipped monsters. The idea is this turns Jinzo into a one-sided card. And because the effect of this can't be negated, you can also actually have the IO lock as well. So you can have IO up while you have this equipped to a Jinzo, shut down your opponent from using traps and spells, and that is pretty darn good. However, actually getting to that point is pretty convoluted. Jinzo is a limited card here. No way to search out Amplifier as well. And also, if you don't have the IO lock up, then your opponent can just activate MST, deal with Amplifier, then deal with Jinzo as well. Also, oftentimes, like, you aren't really fiending to use your own traps while you've got a Jinzo on the field, because if you've got Jinzo on the field, then, you're in a pretty decent spot anyways. The only real trap that you might use are, like, Rain of Destruction and Mirror Force. Maybe Raigeki Break as well if you're playing that. But, like, most of the time, I guess Call of the Haunted too. So I guess there are some traps that you'd want to play, but, like, most of the time, if you've got Jinzo on the field, you're ahead in field presence, you've got the aggressive pressure going, and you don't really feel the need to use your traps. And oftentimes, you can play around your own Jinzo. Like, you don't need to commit traps to board, and oftentimes you aren't going to be using your traps anyways in that situation. So I don't really think Amplifier is that good, and it's just way too specific to see general play. Next up, we got Burst Beam of Destruction. This is a normal spell that says if you control Blue Eyes White Dragon, destroy all monsters your opponent controls. Blue Eyes White Dragon you control cannot attack directly, or cannot attack the turn you activate this card. So really cool, wipes out your opponent's entire board. Unfortunately, the fact that your Blue Eyes can't attack kind of really takes a lot of the teeth out of this card. Because the idea would be you go for this and then you go for an OTK push, but you're losing 3,000 points of damage. You can attack with your other monsters, so that's something. But not being able to attack with Blue Eyes is just a really big blow here. So I don't think this card is that good. Even if you are playing Blue Eyes, which you can't really play Blue Eyes that easily in this format, but even if you are, I don't really think this card is worth it. Next up, we got Dark Magic Attack. Dark Magic Attack is if you control Dark Magician, destroy all spells and traps your opponent controls. So unlike with Burst Stream of Destruction, you actually can attack after this. So I think this makes it a little bit of a better card than Burst Stream of Destruction. However, Dark Magician is not really that good. You can play Dark Magician decks in this format, potentially even with Dedication through Light and Darkness to bring out Dark Magician of Chaos as well, which is kind of a cool combo. But I think in general, like, both Dark Magician and Blue Eyes decks are not really that good in this format, so playing these cards is not really that good either. Next up, we got Earthquake. This is a normal spell that says change all face-up monsters in the field of defense position. It's not bad, I guess. I feel like Book of the Moon is just generally better and has more versatility. Especially being a quick play spell, but I guess this can be used to, like, sort of switch your opponent's monster defense and then you attack over them. So there's that, but I just feel like this card is not really that good. Next up, we got Special Hurricane, normal spell, discard one card from your hand, destroy all special summon monsters on the field. This is kind of neat. You can hit your opponent's chaos monsters, you can hit things brought it off like Mystic Tomato or Shining Angel. You can hit things like, Gravekeeper Spy, for instance, as well, or things revived with Reborn, Call the Haunted, etc. However, I think that, like, at this point in the game's history, a lot of the cards that are going to be on the field are going to be normal summoned. And if your opponent does bring out like a chaos monster, then they're probably going to be winning the game at that point anyways. So I think that this card is a bit too specialized in terms of removal. And also it does cost you a card from hand as well. So I don't really think that that is nice either. So, I don't really think this card is that good. Next up, we got Weapons Change. This is a continuous spell. Says once during each of your standby phases, you can pay 700 life points, then target one warrior or machine type monster you control. Switch the current attack and defense of the target until the end of your opponent's next turn. So this is basically shield and sword, but it can apply to multiple cards. It does have to apply to a warrior or a machine though, so you have to be specific in what deck you play it in. But I'd say that, like, ultimately this card is not really that good because you have to pay 700 life points every standby phase. Or if you want to use it. And also you have to have monsters that actually can benefit from this to a degree where you'd actually want to be playing it. And a lot of monsters do not benefit from it to that degree. So I don't think this is that good. Like, general removal would probably be better. Like, if you want to use this for removal, then just put in general removal instead. If you want to use this for damage, just put in general damage instead. So I think this card is not really that good. Next up, we got the traps. We got Armor Break here. Counter trap, negate the activation of a quick spell card and destroy it. This card is basically useless because MST exists. If your opponent activates an equip, just chain MST to it. If they activate something like, I don't really know. Like, the only thing that this plays around is kind of Imperial Order. But if they activate Imperial Order, they're negating their own equip spell. So it's not really that good. I don't really think that this card is worth playing in any capacity. I can't really see a good case where it actually be really good, where MST would not be better. Next up, we've got Labyrinth of Nightmare, continuous trap that says once per turn during each player's end phase, change the battle positions of all face-up monsters the turn player controls. This is kind of good in, like, clown control, because in clown control deck, you can, like, do interesting plays where you normal summon out a Dream Clown, and then in the end phase, it gets Labyrinth of Nightmare to defense, pop an opponent's monster, etc. I think Stumbling is generally better, though. I think Labyrinth of Nightmare is a little bit too situational, and you're oftentimes not going to get as much value out of it as you do with other cards. So I don't really think it's that good. I mean, it can also switch your opponent's monsters to defense, and then you can attack over them with your own monsters, but then your own monster getting switched to defense, and your opponent can attack over them. So I don't really think this card is the best here, but it is an interesting continuous trap to say the least. Lastly, we've got Micro Array. Micro Array is a normal trap that says target one face-up monster on the field. That target's defense becomes 0 until the end phase of this turn. I mean, this card is, there's so many other removal cards you could use instead. This card is really bad. Yeah, this card is really bad. I mean, I think maybe the main application I can see is if your opponent has a Gravecure Spy up, then you can attack over a Spy with this. But there are just other cards that can remove the Spy instead. This card can't protect you. It can only get aggressive. If you're getting aggressive, why not just use removal instead? So I think this card is really bad. Yeah, I think this card is awful. One of the worst cards in the set for sure. And with that, that is actually the end of the set. These are all the cards in Ancient Sanctuary that actually, like, do things. There were some miscellaneous normal monsters I mentioned that weren't really important, so I didn't mention them. But in terms of the cards that actually, had effects, could potentially be played, these are them. And I think going through all this, keeping in mind the beginning generally good cards and how small that set was, considered against all the other cards in the set, I think the set was actually pretty bad overall. That being said, I think it's a cool set for sure, and it is a milestone because it is the last of the big sets in the early TCG. So kind of cool to see that, but I think overall this set could have been a lot better. And as for Ancient Sanctuary Chaos, I will be sort of covering that format in future videos. I didn't really make this a guide to that format, really. I just wanted to talk about all these cards and how they related to the game at the time. But I'm going to be diving into that format very soon, and I probably won't have as many videos on that as I did for, IOC Chaos, because I think IOC Chaos is the better format, and it's the format that people play more of. But it would be cool to sort of explore Ancient Sanctuary, see what it actually adds to the game. But that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it as always. And, if you want to sort of subscribe to the channel, that would be great. But also, if you want to support me directly, then I do have a Patreon server. link in the description of the video. If you join the Patreon, you will get shout out in these videos. So big shout outs to Brent Donker, Porkchop Coon, GMYFS, and Rinsewin for supporting me. It really means a lot to me, that support, and it really motivates me to make more of these videos. So thank you so much for doing that. And let me know what you think of the Ancient Sanctuary cards down in the comments below. And let me know if you're looking forward to the Ancient Sanctuary Chaos videos. But until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.